Hello, my name is Marissa Lyman, and I will be explaining why probation and parole reform should be supported, including how parole and probation affect people, the biases in probation and parole, how to combat that bias, and how probation and parole reform successfully impact society. Parole and probation not only affect prisoners, but everyone in society. A report from the Urban Institute found that the cost of parole supervision was around $10,000 per person per year. The cost of incarcerating someone who has violated their parole can be expensive, with estimates ranging from $32,000 per year to $70,000 per year. Having a parent on probation or parole can have negative effects on children. A report from the Urban Institute found that children of parents on probation or parole may face an increased risk of poverty, housing instability, and other challenges. A study published in the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation found that children of parents on probation or parole may be more likely to experience anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. Studies have found that people who are poor or homeless are more likely to be denied parole than people who are more financially stable, even when controlling for other factors such as the severity of the offense. Studies have also found that women are less likely to be granted parole than men for similar offenses, and that people who are convicted of drug offenses are more likely to be denied parole than people who are convicted of other types of offenses. There are different types of biases for probation. Some are similar and some are different. Probation and parole share confirmation bias and anchoring bias. Confirmation bias is another bias that occurs when decision makers look for evidence that supports their initial beliefs instead of looking at all the evidence objectively. If a person has a history of drug abuse, the parole board may assume that they are still using drugs, even if there's no evidence to support this belief. If a probation officer believes that a person is likely to reoffend, they may only look for evidence that supports this belief instead of considering all of the evidence objectively. Anchoring bias occurs when decision makers rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, which can skew their decision-making process. If the minimum sentence for armed robbery is 10 years, the parole board may be more likely to give a 10-year sentence to all future cases of armed robbery, even if the circumstances of the crimes are different. If a probation officer receives information that a person has a history of drug abuse, they may assume that the person is still using drugs, even if there's no evidence to support this belief. There are specific biases that happen when dealing with parole, which include racial bias. Racial bias is one of the most common biases in the criminal justice system. It occurs when a person's race or ethnicity affects the decision-making process of judges or parole boards, which includes when a parole board denies parole to a person of color because they believe that they are more likely to reoffend, even if the person has shown that they are rehabilitated and have a low risk of reoffending. When a person of color is given a harsher sentence than a white person for the same crime, which can affect their chances of being granted parole. There are specific biases that happen when dealing with probation, which includes halo effect bias and fundamental attribution error bias. Halo effect bias in probation reform occurs when probation officers form an overall positive or negative impression of a person based on a single trait or characteristic. If a probation officer believes that a person is hardworking, they may assume that the person is also honest and trustworthy, even if there's no evidence to support these beliefs. Fundamental attribution error bias in probation reform occurs when probation officers attribute to a person's behavior to their character or personality, rather than to external factors. If a person violates their probation by missing a meeting with their probation officer, the probation officer may assume that the person is irresponsible, instead of considering that they may have had a valid reason for missing the meeting. There are several ways to combat bias in parole and probation. One way is to implement evidence-based practices, such as risk assessments, that are designed to be objective and reduce the influence of subjective biases by using statistical models to predict a person's likelihood of reoffending, based on factors such as their criminal history, age, and employment status. By relying on objective data, risk assessments can help to reduce the influence of subjective biases in parole decision-making. Another way to combat bias in parole reform is to increase transparency in the decision-making process by providing clear guidelines for how parole and probation decisions are made, and by making information about the decision-making process available to the public. By increasing transparency, it may be possible to reduce the influence of subjective biases and increase accountability. Finally, it is important to provide training to parole and probation board members and other decision makers on how to recognize and combat bias. This can include training on how to identify and control for personal biases, as well as training on how to use evidence-based practices to make objective decisions. By providing training, decision makers can become more aware of their own biases and better equipped to make fair and objective decisions. Probation reform and parole reform can have a number of positive effects on society. These reforms can help reduce the number of people who are incarcerated, which can help reduce the financial burden on taxpayers and free up resources to invest in other areas, such as education and healthcare. These reforms can help reduce recidivism rates, which can help make communities safer by reducing the number of people who are committing crimes. By providing more support services to people on probation and parole, and using data to identify people who are at low risk of reoffending, these reforms can only help ensure that people are getting the help they need to stay out of the criminal justice system. Finally, these reforms can help address issues of racial and economic inequality by reducing the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system on communities of color and low-income communities. I hope I was able to explain how probation and parole affects everyone, the biases in probation and parole, how we can combat bias in probation and parole, and how probation and parole reform positively affects society. Thank you all, and I will see you next time.